Avik, hi.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having us here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Welcome back to Austin. We're so happy to have you here.
It's good to be back.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Austin. I've been coming for years. I've just seen its competition in Nashville, which big fan as well. But it's great to be back here. It's good food, good people, and thank you for letting us use your office.
Nashville is way too muggy, man. I can't handle that weather.
It is, but it's also a little bit more country.
Yeah,
kind of like that.
You like that?
Yeah. I went to a whiskey jam, and I just liked it. I just thought it was a cool place. But listen, if you can go between the two,
Absolutely. Nonstop flights on. I think Southwest has nonstop flights to Nashville.
I think these parts, these kind of, I explained to you before we started, this mix of where you have like a good mix of Democrats and Republicans together, I think is where you get the best of America.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah. Well, very excited to talk to you.
Me too.
You wrote an amazing article.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for sharing it. I will put it in the show notes. Everyone should read it. Bitcoin and the U.S. financial reckoning. Is that correct?
U.S. fiscal reckoning.
Fiscal reckoning.
That too.
That's it, yeah. Not everyone who's going to tune into this might know you. Right. I've mentioned to a couple of people I'm interviewing you, and some people know you, some people don't. So can we just do a background? So let people know who you are, and then we'll dig into this article.
Yeah, so I have a very zigzaggy professional career. I went to college and majored in molecular biology. Then I went to med school. And then after med school, I got recruited by a then unknown investment firm called Bain Capital to invest in biotech companies. I barely knew what a hedge fund was. So I spent 12 years on Wall Street as a healthcare investor, as a portfolio manager. And I'll skip the Bitcoin parts of the story for now, and we can get back into it if you want. But when Mitt Romney ran for president the second time in 2012, since my first job out of med school was at Bain Capital, he had asked me to help him design his health reform plan for the 2012 presidential election. How many times do you get that call? So, so I said, sure. I took a year off of work to do that, and he obviously didn't win. So I didn't join the Romney administration, and I thought I'd go back to Wall Street. But then a bunch of people started asking me, well, now that you're this Republican healthcare guy, what should we do? What should the healthcare plan be of the Republicans? And I said, well, it's pretty simple. You should embrace universal coverage, universal healthcare, but show how free markets, free enterprise, the private sector can deliver it. I got a lot of blank stares when I said that. A lot of people, no, we're going to repeal Obamacare when we get in power in 2016. For those who aren't familiar with U.S. healthcare debates, Obamacare was the big healthcare reform plan that President Obama put out in 2010.
Do you consider that a success?
I would say it is. It was a success in certain ways and a failure in other ways. It certainly didn't live up to expectations, and that was my criticism of it. The thing I always said about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was, yes, every American should have access to affordable health insurance. It's a major component of our financial security. Healthcare is so expensive here. If you aren't insured and you get a big bill, you can go broke. It's a big problem. So, there are ways to have a universal healthcare system that are much cheaper, more fiscally sustainable, and more innovative than the system we have. But we haven't done it for various reasons. And so I said, well, I'm going to take 2 years to actually, I'm like, no one else wants to do this. So I literally just took 2 years off to say, okay, if one were to design a new way of doing healthcare in America that was universally private, meaning it's not a government-based system, it's a private-based system where you have freedom to choose your own insurance plan, your own doctors, your own whatever. But for those who are vulnerable, those who are low income, you're protected. We're going to make sure that you have a backstop, a financial cushion to support your healthcare needs and health insurance needs. And once I did that, I thought, okay, I'll hand it off to whoever, and then go back to Wall Street. But then the 2016 candidates started calling, and in the meantime, somehow I started blogging about healthcare just because I didn't know what else to do. And that took on a life of its own. Forbes made me its policy editor, which I still am. So I'm the policy editor of Forbes. I manage our public policy coverage. So I wrote a lot about healthcare and fiscal policy for them. And I started a think tank called the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, where we are shooting this today, which focuses on how to achieve expand economic opportunity for Americans on the bottom half of the economic ladder, using free enterprise, economic freedom, entrepreneurship, technological innovation, things like that. And the basic point, the thing that I took away from my healthcare work, and the thing I took away from my my think tank work was politics. We think of politics as the left versus the right. And Bitcoin's a great example of this. It doesn't always have to be the left versus the right, right? Like you can achieve a progressive policy goal like universal health insurance, but have a system that's actually more fiscally sustainable, where there's more choice, more innovation, more of a free market. So there are ways for both sides to win. And that's not just true in healthcare, that's true in a lot of things. So basically what ended up happening is I was running a long-short equity healthcare portfolio during the financial crisis, saw from my Bloomberg terminal the end of the world in 2008. I had a bunch of friends from that world who were into Austrian economics, who were following Bitcoin from the very beginning, and they were in my ear about it. But it was too intimidating for me. I was like, "What? I have to learn how to code. I have to figure out how to get a wallet. How am I going to do all this? This is like, this is just too complicated. I can't run a node. Like, whoa, I'm too busy. I'll figure this out eventually." And then what happened was Mt. Gox crashed.
Yep.
And I think Bitcoin went from like 1,200 to 300. I'm like, okay, if I don't drop everything and figure this out now, shame on me. So I did. I just paused everything for a minute, spent some time working on it, and I took a good chunk of my biotech winnings and plopped it into Bitcoin. Nice. And that just obviously, even though biotech has had a pretty good run over these last 10 years, so has Bitcoin, so has crypto. So I had to pay more and more attention to it and got more into it and certainly understood certain aspects of it where I had high conviction. You're like, for some people, they get into Bitcoin because they love the technology, right? For me, I had that high conviction about the fiscal side of it, the monetary side of it, the fact that healthcare is the biggest driver of America's debt and deficit crisis. And I spent a lot of time trying to reform and fix the U.S. healthcare system. So I know how hard it is firsthand, how hard it's going to be for us to solve our debt and deficit problems. So even though my day job involves trying to fix those problems, in a sense, my portfolio, my investments, and a lot of my kind of worldview is driven by the possibility, if not the likelihood, that we fail to solve these problems. And if we fail to solve these problems, what happens? And 2008 was a bit of a preview, and that we saw around the world countries go into sovereign debt crises. It's not the first time that's ever happened, obviously. And Bitcoin will obviously play over time. I shouldn't say obviously because it's not obvious to everyone. But to us, it's obvious that over time, Bitcoin will play an increasing role in that problem. Like how the U.S. finances debt. Can it continue to run these trillions and trillions of dollars of debt? Can the advanced economies continue to do that? And before, we had no recourse, right? Countries would devalue their currency, and you couldn't do anything about it. You were stuck. When Nixon left the gold peg in 1971, as you know well.
What the fuck happened in 1971?
Right. In fact, I tried to give I tried to give Ben a shout out in my article, and they edited it out. So apologies for that, Ben.
We'll get a shout out to Ben here.
Yeah. So
and heavy arm clown.
Exactly. Yeah. So you couldn't do anything about it. If you held dollars at that time in America, you were stuck. I mean, yes, if you were an institutional investor, you could buy gold, you could trade on it. But if you were just an average person, you were stuck. Your value of your dollars went down by 10, 20x. So today it's different, right? We have Bitcoin. And the question is, for how long will that be true? Will we get to a point where the U.S. really does struggle to finance its debt? And when that happens, how does Washington react? Does Washington then look at Bitcoin as truly a competitor? Right now, they look at Bitcoin sort of like, what is this thing? People are losing their money or making money. They're evading taxes. What are they doing? I don't know. But if the government if people in Washington eventually start to think of Bitcoin as a competitor to Treasury bonds, which is the way I look at the world. Some people say, well, you should be able to buy your coffee with Bitcoin. That's a competitor. And that's obviously, we're trying that out in El Salvador and other places. But the bigger story to me is if Bitcoin ever does compete with Treasury bonds as the premier store of wealth in the world, that's a really, really big deal. That transforms the entire way the world economy works. And the reason I wrote this article that you mentioned is to try to walk Washington through that, because the journal I published in, and I made a point of publishing it in that journal because it's something that's widely read in Washington. So just to help members of Congress, people in the Treasury Department, staff who support those agencies and individuals, help those who aren't already familiar with cryptocurrency, which is most of them, have a way of thinking about that transition. The fact that, as our debt piles up and piles up and piles up, the temptation is going to want to restrict that competition, prevent that competition from taking place. And the argument I try to make in the piece is, no, if you want to protect the ability of lower income and middle income Americans to protect themselves from inflation, from the irresponsibility of the government, then you've got to allow them to have this alternative store of value.
Well, a lot to unpack there. I'm going to come back to the Bitcoin thing. I'm really fascinated about talking about the healthcare side of things. It's not something I talk about a lot on the podcast. It's something I'm acutely aware of because we have a very different system in the UK.
Sure do.
At the moment, we have universal healthcare, but it's state-run, which has its pros and cons. It's highly inefficient. It wastes a lot of money, a lot of bureaucracy. But if we ignore the fact that we've got these extended wait lists at the moment because of COVID, the fact of the matter is, in the UK, whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever age you are, whatever gender, whatever color you are, whoever you are, if you get knocked down, you have a heart attack, you get cancer, you will get treatment. You can be treated. And maybe not as fast as if you have private healthcare, but you also have the options. So I have options to use the National Health Service, but I also have very cheap private healthcare. I pay £150 a month for myself, my son, and my daughter.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I spend over $1,000 a month, $1,200 a month for myself here.
And the equivalent of a deductible that you have, mine's like £150 or something. So when I had my back injury recently, I got back from where was I? Yeah, I was in El Salvador. Got back from El Salvador, phoned up my private health care, and within 4 days I was in surgery and I was repaired. So I have that option. And a recent thing that's we've got is that there's quite big waits to get into the GPs, the general practitioners. Can be 2 to 3 weeks because they're so busy. We've now got private GPs open up by appointment. So you can pay £50 and usually get seen that day or the day after. So we're starting to get some kind of easing off on the pressure of the NHS because there's private services, but still have that universal healthcare. I think it's a pretty good system. If I'm talking to some Bitcoiners, they're like, no, this is socialism, this is state-run, it's really bad. I'm pretty sure if you surveyed people in the UK, 95% of people plus would say, no, we like this system. It can be improved, but we like this system. I come out to the US and I have friends here, and I remember meeting somebody and they were telling me of a story of like his daughter. She broke her finger surfing. He called the wrong ambulance. He was meant to call one company, called the wrong one, and he got thousands. He had to pay thousands of pounds. He had £5,000 deductible. He ended up just spending an awful lot of money. I've heard about people like with a broken leg having to remortgage their house because they didn't have healthcare coverage. So it's a big intro, but something I'm acutely aware of. You must have studied UK and other health systems around the world. What do you believe the perfect model is?
Yeah, it's a question I care about a lot, actually. And we actually at FreeUp, my think tank, we have a whole program called the World Index of Healthcare Innovation, where we rank the top 31 countries, that is to say the wealthiest 31 countries by income, by GDP per capita around the world that have a population over 5 million, and compare them on all sorts of metrics that you'd want us to compare them on, not just how many people have health insurance, which is sort of a traditional thing that people look at, but how good are the health outcomes? How much choice do you have in your treatment, in your doctor? How much innovation, scientific innovation, is actually going on in that country? How many patents? How much R&D? How many Nobel Prizes? And how much IT is being used to advance the quality of care and delivery? And we actually we ranked, the U.S. ranked fifth in our survey. Number one was Switzerland. The top three were Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. And I can't remember this year if it was Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, 1, 2, 3, or it was Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany. But Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany, and Ireland was fourth, and the U.S. was fifth, and I think the U.K. was like eighth or ninth, so it wasn't at the bottom.
Okay, that's quite interesting because if I compare and contrast the UK and the US, I think I prefer the UK system, but I know if I was in the US, I could afford private healthcare. So but I think as a net, I prefer it. But the one thing I'm clearly aware of between the two is that if I'm relying on the NHS, I'm probably going to have to wait a longer time to get seen, because I'll be obliged to have healthcare coverage here. I also feel like US healthcare innovation is way ahead of the UK. We have a lot of people who raise money to come and get treatment in the US for specific cancer treatments because you're way ahead. Is that where the UK falls down?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the US got dinged in our survey on a couple of things. One, affordability, which is exactly what you said. Another, which is related, is fiscal sustainability, because we spend so much on healthcare, not just on the private side, but the public spending on healthcare. U.S. government subsidies for healthcare per capita is higher than every other country in the world, even though there are people who are uninsured here, even though it's still expensive when you're paying out of pocket. That's how bad our system is. So we ding the U.S. really heavily for that, for those two things, affordability and fiscal sustainability. But where the U.S. really dominates, the gap between the number one and number two country on this particular thing was massive, was science and technology.
Right, okay.
Nobel Prizes per capita, patents per capita, new drugs developed by companies native to that country. The UK actually does pretty well on a lot of these things. The UK scientific culture is very, very strong, and that's why the UK ranked as highly as it did. If it weren't for the scientific culture and the academic culture of Oxbridge and things like that in the UK probably would have done worse because of the wait times and other things. Affordability is good in the UK, but it's good in a number of countries, so that alone wouldn't distinguish it from, say, a France.
Right. So what is it the Swiss have got so right?
What the Swiss do really well is they've got, and Germany is like this too. Germany and Switzerland are very similar in terms of our rankings, slightly different systems, but similar in our rankings. They're basically all private systems. So in Switzerland, everyone chooses their own insurance. It's not like you have the NHS, or if you can afford to get outside the NH system, you can. In Switzerland, everybody buys their own health insurance, and it's bought as an individual. So you have complete choice. There are dozens of insurers competing with one another. You have access to all the latest technology. So a new drug comes out, the Swiss get it pretty quickly, as do the Brits, actually, believe it or not. You have new treatments. You have a system that's fiscally very sustainable, and a big part of why it's sustainable is, unlike the NHS system where the government's paying for everybody's healthcare regardless of whether you need the help or not. The Swiss system, they basically subsidize the bottom quarter of the population. They say, look, if you're middle class or you're upper middle class, you can afford to buy your own health insurance. You can afford to buy your cable bill, your cell phone contract. You should be able to afford health insurance too. So because of that, their system costs the government a lot less. And so from a fiscal sustainability, it's really good, along with having the universality, the affordability, and the choice. So it's a really good thing to point to Americans, because a lot of Americans falsely believe that our system is the most free market system in the world. It's not even close. As I mentioned before, government subsidies per capita here are the highest in the world. We have a heavily regulated system. We basically have the worst of both worlds. We massively subsidize the system, but we don't actually try to make it affordable. So there are a lot of things that U.S. needs to improve on to get better. And a part of that argument that we put forward in the World Index of Healthcare Innovation is to help people who think the status quo is just fine, and they're saying, well, if we become more like Europe, that's bad. Actually, there are countries in Europe that are a better model if you believe in a more a choice-oriented and competitive-oriented system.
Right. So in terms of the US system, if you're getting the best of both worlds, who's winning in this? Because I always believe there must be somebody winning. Is it lobbyists? Is it the insurance companies themselves? Is it the pharmaceutical companies? Somebody must be winning in this.
The simplest way to put it is, in the U.S., we spend about $4 trillion a year on healthcare. So the people who are receiving the $4 trillion have a very powerful incentive for that number to go up and not down.
Right.
And they have a lot of money and a lot of resources to convince Congress and the executive branch, the presidency, that they're right. And that's, to give an example, one of the examples that actually doesn't get highlighted a lot is the hospital industry. In pretty much every part of America, the two largest employers are the public schools and the hospital. So if you're a member of Congress and your hospital comes to you, the CEO of that hospital is probably making $10 million a year, comes to you and says, gosh, if you try to do anything to lower the cost of hospital care, then we're going to go broke. We'll have to close this hospital. And tens of thousands of jobs could be lost. You're as a congressman, you're like, well, you're probably BSing me. But if you're not, I'm the one who's going to get blamed if I sign on to this. And everyone's just runs around terrified that if they try to reduce the cost of hospital care, whether it's through competition, through price controls, whether you're left or right, whatever method you would like to use to reduce the cost of care, the price of care, people are afraid to do it because the hospitals are that large employer, particularly in rural areas where sometimes they are the largest employer. So that's an example of how hard it is, how entrenched the interests are to make the system better. It's not just the hospitals. It's the pharmaceutical industry. It's doctors. It's everything pretty much.
Well, there's a similar problem with the prison system as well, because I spent a lot of time with Lynn Ulbricht, the mother of Ross Ulbricht. And she's become whilst she's been campaigning to try and have Ross freed, she's also become a campaigner for prison reforms. And she said one of the biggest problems is that where the prisons are, they are often the biggest employer in the town. So to have any form of prison reform, which maybe would remove non-violent criminals from jails, would lead to a loss of jobs, and that would not be popular in local communities. So it sounds like that's almost a very similar scenario.
You know, you're right, and you reminded me that since she's relatively local, I should reach out to her here in Austin, right? I mean, or at least I know.
I think she might have moved actually, but like if you want to connect with her, I can connect you with her. She'd probably love to hear from you
because we do work in criminal justice reform too. So we work on all sorts of things. We work on obviously now crypto, but also healthcare, energy, housing policy, criminal justice, all sorts of areas where education reform, all sorts of areas where we think innovation and free enterprise can drive progressive policy outcomes. And about 70% of our work has to do with the rising cost of living, which is partly about monetary policy, but it's also about other things. It's about regulations and subsidies and rules that allow people or incentivize people to raise their price. You take the way how much college costs in America. A big part of that is we massively subsidize the cost of college in terms of these loans, these student loan programs that are run by the federal government, but we don't hold colleges accountable for what they charge. So basically we say, we want college to be free, so let's just basically pay the bill as a government. But the end result is the colleges say, thank you very much, we're just going to raise our prices by 10% and just get more and more money. And that's exactly how healthcare works here too. So we have a lot of problems like that in America where the cost of everyday life is going up. And our argument is that if we actually bring a more decentralized, pro-competition, pro-choice approach to those areas of the economy, you can make life better for a lot of people.
How do you break the deadlock of the incentives for the hospitals and the pharmaceuticals? Because it points to another thing I've been thinking a lot about recently. A few months ago, I spent a lot of time reading the U.S. Constitution and the forming of modern America, and it feels to me at the moment politics is very broken in the US. But it's broken in some ways, but in other ways it's great. Like the state system is proven to work. We see in migration of people to here, to Nashville, to Miami. People are moving their companies and their jobs based on the local rules. That to me is a system that works, because my only option in the UK is to leave the country. I can't move to London, have different rules, or Manchester. And I envy that. But at the same time, politics seems to have just become this, I don't want to use the word corrupt, just broken, dirty system of fighting, arguing, perpetuated by the media and social media, not really working for the people. It feels like with the forming the US Constitution, it was about a government for the people, and it feels now it's a government for the corporations. And that's probably something that you've looked at. And if I've said anything wrong here, because I'm British, you can fix my errors. But do you see what I'm saying?
Totally. And a couple points I'll make related to that. The first is it's absolutely hard to try to change these structural problems in America, which is exactly why I'm doing. This is exactly why I dropped out of the hedge fund business to take on these problems, because I want to be able to look back on my life when I'm 80 and feel like I tried to solve something really hard. Maybe I'll fail. I'll probably fail. But in the 15% chance that we succeed at free op, then we've changed history. We've done something really important for this country. So that's why we do it, because it's a lot easier to say, okay, we're going to take some small problem and solve that, and then count that as a win, because what we want are wins. And for us, yes, those things are important. I don't want to discount the importance of incremental progress, but solving the big problems matters too. So once you actually try, once you say your goal is to solve those big structural problems, you have to think about them very differently. And this gets to the second part of my answer, which is, okay, if you want to solve these structural problems of how do you take on the hospital industry, or how do you take on the kind of corporate industrial subsidy crony capitalism kind of complex that we have in the US, and work backwards from there, how do you solve that problem? And one of the most important things you have to do to solve that problem is you've got to address some of the political divisions in the country. So that's where you get to the whole idea of free ops mission, where we say we're trying to solve progressive we're trying to answer progressive policy problems, or the solutions to progressive policy problems, using free enterprise. So it's a way of uniting people who think of themselves as Republican and people who think of themselves as Democrats, or people who think of themselves as moderates, and say, hey, there are solutions that you can advance, that you can advocate for from in terms of standpoint of legal reform, regulatory reform, whatever, that allow you to champion your values. These aren't compromises. These aren't things that split the difference. These are things where you can say this is a progressive thing to do, or this is a free market thing to do, and not be wrong. Both can be true at the same time. Just as I think one of the things that we both love about Bitcoin is that it can do that too, right? It is both progressive and also very pro-freedom at the same time.
So what do you think about term limits and age limits for members of Congress? Because that's something that came up recently. I met somebody who's running for Congress, and she said one of the biggest issues is that we don't have term limits. She thinks that's one of the most important policy changes that the US could have is term limits and age limits on people in Congress. What do you feel about that? Because you have term limits for the presidency.
We do. I think age limits is an interesting idea. There's a good side and a bad side to term limits. The good side is, I think, what's obvious to most people, which is people get too comfortable in Washington. They become insiders. They're only responsive to lobbyists, and that only becomes more so over time. And they just lose perspective from the real world. All that's true. There's one downside, which is when you're dealing with all these highly technical things that the government now regulates or controls, it is valuable to have policy knowledge.
Okay.
Right? Like you're talking about the healthcare system is a great example, right? Healthcare is incredibly complicated in the US. And if you have people who've only been serving for 4 or 8 years, it's very hard to learn enough about the healthcare system to actually know it well, especially when, as a member of Congress, you're doing 20 different things at the same time. You're rarely very focused on one single issue. I mean, yes, like, for example, we know that Cynthia Lummis loves crypto, and she's very interested in that. But she's also having to, deal with a lot of other issues that don't have anything to do with crypto that are important to her state in Wyoming, right? And that's true of every member of Congress. So it's very hard for members of Congress to have that depth in an issue. And if they're there a little bit longer, that helps. But I do think the age thing would help, because I think what you see a lot of times is these 80-year-old senators who think everything is the same it was when they were 30, and it's not, and there are new solutions to problems that weren't available when they were maybe out in the private sector, out in the free world. So I feel like there could be a lot more turnover, and that'd be helpful.
Right. Okay. So the big problems that need solving, the biggest problems that need solving, and a big question, like, what are they? What will you tackle first, and how would you tackle it?
Well, boy, there are a lot of big problems, but I'd say what's the biggest problem? Maybe that's the way to put it. And the single biggest problem in America is the fact that America is insolvent. Everything else really stems from that. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, if America, like, we have grown up, you didn't grow up here, but for those of us who did, but all of us grew up in the Pax Americana. Like, we grew up in a world that was basically where the U.S. was the leading power, especially after the end of the Cold War. And we're just kind of used to that relative stability in the world that comes from there being that order of, okay, the U.S. is the leading power, and the U.S. is a relatively benign leading power. We're not trying to generally conquer other countries and incorporate them into the United States. And so, people complain about the U.S., but relative to other, leading powers over the lens of human history, the U.S. has actually been pretty good. And the problem is, what happens if the U.S. can't finance its debts? What if the U.S. has a massive economic crash? Then what? And I think that's a huge problem. And we're instead of actually trying to solve it, in certain ways, we're making it worse. The various spending bills that Congress is considering now, the massive printing of U.S. dollars at the Federal Reserve, we're doing things to actually drive us, push the accelerator down in terms of going over the cliff, not trying to slow down. So, to me, that's the biggest problem that we have to solve, because if we don't solve that, all the other problems become really trivial. Well,
there's no incentive for any president to take that medicine to give up. I explained to somebody recently, it's like any addiction. You can put off all your addictions. I'll give up tomorrow. I'll give up the next day. I'll give up the next day. Because giving up any form of addiction is very difficult. You have to go through a cold turkey period. You have to go through a withdrawal period. And it feels like, I think even Giacomo Zucco referred to that to me a long time ago. He said, really, America has an addiction now to printing money. And for any president to take the foot off the gas means they're going to be the one that led them into a perhaps very tough economic period, which has all its associated geopolitical issues and a contagion that will spread around the world. But it feels like there's no incentive for any president to take that. Why would they?
I agree with you to a significant degree, but here's where I might offer a note of optimism, which is
Great.
like, most people who are in politics in America, true in most countries, right? They want to be president someday. They look in the mirror and they see a president in the mirror, right?
Yep.
But once you've actually been president, what really matters? What really matters, what should matter, and I think what matters to a lot of presidents is what's their place in history, right? 50 years after you're president, what are people going to think of your presidency? That starts to matter a lot to presidents once you've actually made it to the White House. And so I think once you get to that point, yes, it's the problem is all those things you did to climb up the ladder, those are your habits. Your habits are always to think about the next election or how am I doing in the polls, or that's always going to be a part of your cast of mind as a politician. But I do think that some presidents more than others really try to think hard about their legacy. What are people going to think of me 50 years from now? And if you are thinking about that, then you're going to be much more concerned about the problems that we've been discussing.
So how bad is this economic position from your perspective? Obviously, you wrote the article,
right?
The fiscal reckoning, and how close do you believe the US is to their fiscal reckoning? What is the fiscal reckoning? Like, what's the point in time we're heading towards?
Well, this is one of the things that I talk about at length in the piece, which is people who are fiscal hawks that raise a lot of concerns about the debt and deficit and say, this is a real problem in America. We can't do this for long. The counter argument to that is, well, we've been doing it. We've been doing it for 50, 60 years, and we're still number one. Inflation, yes, inflation is up right now, and we're recording this in 2021, but over the last 30 years 40 years since Reagan and Volcker tamped down inflation in 1981, we haven't had a lot of inflation in the U.S. So you have a lot of people say, well, what's the big deal? People still buy Treasury bonds. Inflation is low. So obviously it doesn't matter if we rack up all this debt. Who cares? Nobody cares. We're living in some sort of new world where none of this really matters. And that has been true up to now. And so the question is, what changes that? And what I walk through in the article are some indicators that it's starting to change. And that is to say, to start to use one example, how is it exactly that we borrow money as a country? It's not that different from actually the way we borrow money as people. So as people, we borrow money by taking out a mortgage on our house or getting a credit card. And the credit card company agrees to lend us the money, or the bank agrees us to do the mortgage. And they're only going to lend us that money if they think we can pay it back. And if they're worried that we're not going to pay it back, they might charge us a higher interest rate, right? And that's pretty much how it works with governments too. So governments issue treasury bonds, or treasury bonds in the case of the U.S., or sovereign debt in the case of countries in general. And the individuals and investors and institutions that buy those treasury bonds are effectively lending the U.S. government money. And the way that the bond markets work is, if there's a lot of demand for those bonds, if people really want to buy those bonds, the effective result is the interest rate is lower. And if there's weak demand for the bonds, the interest rate goes up.
And also risk with the bonds.
Exactly.
So you can get a high interest rate for Argentinian bonds, but they come at high risk.
Right, and that's exactly how those things all go together, right? So the reason why the interest rate is higher is because you're worried that the default risk is higher. That's why you actually demand a higher interest rate. And so people look at treasury bonds and say, well, hey, treasury bond interest rates are really low. They're near zero. This is true in Europe too. This is true in Japan. So obviously there's no problems, right? We have almost zero interest rates. So clearly nobody cares about the U.S. debt. But that's not true, because the interest rate that right now you can get on a U.S. treasury bond is effectively an artificial rate. That's not a true market rate for a number of different reasons, the most important of which is that the Federal Reserve is buying up a good chunk, roughly half, depending on exactly how you count it, roughly half of the Treasury bonds that the Treasury Department issues are being bought not by outside investors, not by outside governments or companies or hedge funds, but by the Federal Reserve. And that's a problem. It's kind of like if you take out a credit card, Peter, and you rack up a huge bill and you say, gosh, I don't think I can pay this bill. I'm going to take out another credit card, pay off the first credit card bill, and then we'll worry about the second credit card bill later.
And I've got friends who've done that, and I know how that ends up.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so that's kind of what we've been doing. And there are a couple of other things I talk about in the piece. That's not the only one. So there's an informal form of banking regulation called the Basel Accords which basically it's a group of countries, financially significant countries that get together and basically try to harmonize their banking regulations so that you don't have a situation where some banks are being very conservative in their capital cushions and other banks are not. And so all the capital flows to the more risky banks, and that creates systemic problems for the world economy. So they try to harmonize their rules. And one of the things they do to harmonize the rules is say, we're going to reward you if you hold Treasury bonds, and we're going to punish you if you own risky assets like Bitcoin, for example. They don't want banks to own Bitcoin. But we're going to reward you if you own Treasury bonds. If you own Treasury bonds, we're basically going to treat that like hard cash. And so what ends up happening if you're Bank of America or Deutsche Bank or whatever bank it is, Sumitomo in Japan, you're rewarded for owning U.S. Treasury bonds and some other forms of government debt as well, but particularly U.S. Treasury bonds because there's so many of them because we're so big as a country. And so for reasons like that, there's an artificial increased demand for U.S. debt. People want to buy it because they're effectively steered that way or forced that way by regulators. Along with you have the Federal Reserve buying them. So you have the situation where the demand for Treasury bonds is goosed and the interest rates are artificially low. And what happens over time? You can't continue that forever. And the reason you can't continue that forever is because the debt is growing and growing and growing. When Obama left office, the U.S. federal debt was $8 trillion. Today, it's $29 trillion. Within 10, 20 years, it could be $100 trillion. So you're having to issue more and more of this Treasury debt, these Treasury bonds. Who's going to buy them? And what we see if we look at some of those underlying indicators is very alarming.
It sounds like a racket.
There have been a lot of strong words or descriptors used to describe the U.S. Fiscal situation. Ponzi scheme is one you hear a lot. Racket is another. It's a big problem. And, you started with the question of how long will it take for this to play out? None of us know, right? None of us know when the denouement will happen. But what we do know is that the problem is getting worse. So one of the indicators I talk about in the article is that the share of Treasury bonds owned by foreign investors has declined by like 20% over the last 10 years. And the share owned by the Federal Reserve has gone up by about 10% over the last 10 years. Those curves are going to cross. We're going to get to a point pretty soon when the single largest holder of U.S. debt is the U.S. government. And that's just not, that's Latin America level monetary and fiscal policy. That just does not fly. And yes, we're the biggest country in the world. And we can probably get away with it longer than most. And the U.S. dollar is the world currency. And there are a lot of reasons why we're going to be able to get away with it longer than a random country that can't issue debt in its own currency, right? That is a big advantage, the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. But there comes a point where there just aren't enough banks out there or governments out there with trillions of dollars to put into Treasury bonds.
Does it become easier for the US to default when they're the ones holding the debt? And is that really a default on the people? I mean, we're really talking about, could we even see a situation? I'm trying to articulate this, but I'm thinking, is this the equivalent of chopping zeros off the Venezuela Bolivar?
It can be like that. So, there's different kinds of default. Like the formal or hard default that most people are familiar with is like, you don't pay your rent. Or in the case of the U.S., you don't pay the bond.
But that's not going to happen, right? They're going to soft default via inflation.
Yeah, exactly. So the way the U.S. has been doing it effectively, monetary expansion is a form of default, right?
Yeah.
If you double the number of U.S. dollars in circulation, all else being equal, each of those dollars is worth half. That's a form of default. When Nixon left the gold peg in 1971, that was a default. So there are things that we're doing that actually should be called defaults that aren't. And the question is, at what point do people decide that they're tired of it? And that's where Bitcoin comes in, right? Bitcoin, as we record this, is 12 years old. What happens when Bitcoin is 25 years old? When people get more used to it, when the people who are in their 40s and running multi-billion-dollar funds, they've lived their whole lives, certainly sentient lives in a world where Bitcoin existed. And they don't think of it as this novelty. They think of it as just part of the ether, just like Facebook. Kids grow up now, they were born after Facebook was invented. For them, Facebook is what their grandparents used to talk to each other, right? There comes a point where Bitcoin is the same. It's the thing that your grandparents use as opposed to the other way around. And at that point, you're going to see more and more people think of Bitcoin the way Ray Dalio and Paul Tudor Jones do, where they say, you know what? I'm not going to go whole hog into Bitcoin. I'm not going to put 90% of my fund into Bitcoin, but am I going to start to gradually shave off what I allocate to Treasury bonds and shave in what I allocate to Bitcoin? That is happening and will continue to happen. And there comes a point where that transition is complete, that the U.S. will have a tough time financing its debt. And look, it's going to be really a challenging time for the U.S. And I think one of the things I try to talk about in the article is not to sugarcoat that, right? Like a lot of us who support what Bitcoin stands for, we want to say, well, this world in which Bitcoin takes over is going to be so awesome and so wonderful. And look, it will be a freer world in a lot of ways than the world we live in now, but there will be pain points along the way.
Of course. I mean, that's one of the things I often talk about to Bitcoin is it's like, sometimes I don't enjoy celebrating certain things that people seem to celebrate because it's good for Bitcoin, because we know the people who are going to be most affected by this. It's not going to be the wealthiest. It's going to be the middle and lower class. It's going to be most affected by this. I just want to come back to the default, though, because a hard default is hard to argue against. Somebody doesn't pay their debt. They've defaulted. A soft default via inflation. So there's a strong argument that the US government is in the process of defaulting right now, because 5.4% inflation, which I think nobody agrees is actually real.
Right.
I've really noticed the increase of costs on this trip, the amount of money I'm paying for things. One morning I got with Preston Pish, and we got 2 bacon and egg sandwiches and 2 bowls of water. It was like $38. I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
But I've really noticed the increase in prices. I was with my friend Brandy yesterday. She's a hairdresser. She's had to put up her prices 20-30% because of the materials. Her materials have gone up so much. Her rent's gone up so much. So this 5.4% inflation, I don't think anyone really believes. So my question is, could we argue that the US is defaulting right now? And also, have you looked into how bad this might actually get?
The answer is, I think yes and yes, which is to say that I completely agree with you. And I talk about this in the article, the fact that the conventional measures of inflation, consumer price index, and the personal consumption expenditures that the Fed uses, these are artificially designed measures of inflation that in various ways exclude the things that are actually driving up the cost of living for average Americans.
What the fuck?
I mean, to give one example, just the way that the CPI and PCA measure housing costs.
Yep.
Which I know you've talked about on your show, the owner's equivalent rent, which is basically, there's this survey where they ask you, okay, if you were to rent out your house, how much do you think you could charge in rent? Which most people don't know. They've never rented a house. They've never been a landlord. How would they know? Right? When all you have to do is look at Zillow or any of these other third-party databases, you know how much home prices are going up. And look, if you own your house, that's great. You're making more money. If you have money in the stock market, which is where all the extra dollars the Fed prints go, that's great. You're doing well. But if you haven't bought a house yet and you're trying to, or you're renting, or you don't have a lot of savings and you don't know where to start, you're falling further and further behind. And that's a huge problem. So socially, it's a huge problem. And in terms of what is actually the return on a Treasury bond, which is a way to think about your point about whether or not people should own Treasury bonds or not, from a standpoint of, are we defaulting? If you use the conventional metric, which is the interest rate on the Treasury bond minus the inflator, if the inflator is 5%, if you're using that number, and the interest rate on the bond is 0.5%, then yeah, that's a negative return of 4.5%. That's not great, Bob. And that's before you think about the fact that if you're an institutional investor, if you're Ray Dalio, say, that's not how you're judged. You're not judged on whether you outperform inflation. You're judged by whether or not you outperform the stock market, right? So the stock market is booming because of all those extra Fed dollars floating in the system. The venture capital market booming because of all those Fed dollars flowing into the system. And so when you're competing against those asset classes, let alone crypto, to try to figure out how you beat them, holding Treasury bonds becomes less and less appealing. And that's for professional investors. Think about it if you're a government, right? Let's say you are Germany, right? And Germany is a very conservative place. They're going to be probably the last people to try to take on some of these more cutting edge investment approaches. But they're also very attuned to the problem of inflation. They have obviously a long history of it with the Weimar Republic, and they care a lot about it. It's the country that has done the best in terms of being fiscally responsible, precisely because it's seared into their brain what a tragedy fiscal irresponsibility and fiscal crises and monetary crises can be.
And I think the rest of the EU is grateful.
Right. I mean, if it weren't for Germany, the EU would look very different. That's absolutely right. So, But think about that. If you're Germany, what are you doing right now? You're basically guaranteeing that your balance sheet, the money that you have in your treasury, is declining in value every month, every year. The famous an analogy of Michael Saylor, it's a melting ice cube, right? And that just can't go on forever, right? It can go on for a time where you put up with it when it's a trickle. But there comes a point where, particularly as more and more countries, if the El Salvador experiment works and that country becomes a wealthy country over time, and other countries start to follow that and say, you know what, we're going to put some Bitcoin on our balance sheet, then what happens? Right? And they start to see that outperformance over time, over a 10, 20, 30-year period. It becomes this kind of snowball effect. And a way to analogize it for those of us who are old enough to remember is when Netflix destroyed Blockbuster, or when Amazon destroyed Barnes & Noble, right? So these big box chains of bookstores in the case of Barnes & Noble, or video cassette rentals and DVD rentals in the case of Blockbuster, they didn't fall apart. They didn't go broke overnight when Netflix came on the scene or when Amazon came on the scene. It took 10 years, right? And so something similar will happen here. It may not be 10 years, it may be 20 years. I don't know. But it will happen in our lifetimes. I think I'm pretty certain about that. I think if you put a gun to my head and made me predict, I'd say within 10 to 20 years.
Well, there's two aspects to this. There's the high street banks. We refer to them as Lloyds, NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland in the UK. It's Wells Fargo, Chase, etc. here. But there's also the money itself and central banks, and both are being disrupted at the same time.
Right.
We should probably talk about both, but let's just talk about El Salvador, because you did mention it. If it works. I would say right now it's working.
Yep.
And I would say there's kind of three indicators that show me it's working. So we have, I think the last numbers reported 2.1 million people have downloaded the Chivo wallet.
3 million now.
Is it 3 million?
I wrote a piece today for Forbes about it. 3 million is the latest number from Bukele.
I mean, so it's from Bukele. I've obviously interviewed him, but he does work for the government, and so we don't know the exact figures. But even if it's 2 million,
right.
This is potentially. And we know, say, 70% of people don't have bank accounts. Right. We're talking about millions of people are now getting access to banking services. We've seen the report that more money is being used to buy Bitcoin than to sell Bitcoin now. So we've had the initial dump, whoever wanted to get rid of it. We have is it £2 million a day or a week that's being sent back by remittance. And also all the Bitcoin they've bought is now in the green.
Right.
So I would say right now it's a success. We don't know in 6 months, a year. We don't know if there'll be a bear market. We don't know if the price will be stable. We don't know if, that's to be proven. But even if the price changes, even if the price of Bitcoin drops and, maybe their Bitcoin investment on a certain time scale isn't in the green, all the additional investment, opportunity, money, banking services brought to the country, to me, is already proven it's a success. I think if someone like Hanke only points to the price of Bitcoin, he's missing the actual bigger picture for El Salvador. They're plugged into a open monetary network. Everybody's interested in it. Loads of us have been to visit. Loads of us have witnessed what's happened. So I really think it's a success. It depends on your measures.
Yeah, Hanke used to be one of my contributors in the Forbes policy team, and he's not there anymore. But we tweak each other on various other media, and so we have different views on that topic. I mean, I think that what's really interesting, the National Affairs article that we've been talking about, I don't mention price really at all in that article because it's more about that long view issue of what happens to the U.S. government and the Fed and Treasury bonds. But what's interesting in the case of El Salvador is September 2021 was when the law became effective. And that month was not, from a price standpoint, a great month for Bitcoin. It went from like 47,000 to like 41,000. Mm-hmm. And even so, the Chivo wallet was downloaded by 3 million people. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, gives you an indicator of the resilience or the robustness of the effort. And there was a new thing that was announced relatively recently where you're going to get a 20 cent per gallon discount on your gas if you pay through the Chivo wallet as opposed to
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So the Chivo negotiated with the gas stations, or I don't know if it's the petrol companies directly or the gas stations, but they're going to have a 20 cent discount because I guess because of middleman fees or whatever, they can pass on some of those savings to the consumers. So
right.
If you have a car in El Salvador, that's a big deal, right? So the adoption's only going to grow there. And the last sentence in my Forbes article, the most recent one is, look, if Bitcoin can work for the poorest Salvadorans, it can work for everyone. And I think that's what makes the Salvadoran experiment so interesting and so important. I think a lot about Clayton Christensen, who was this Harvard Business School professor who came up with this concept of disruptive innovation, and the big contribution intellectually of his was the way a lot of innovation and disruptive innovation happens is it starts with the low end of the market. So the Japanese car companies come into America and they start selling these compact cars that cost $5,000. And the Cadillacs and the Lincolns, the big brands, are like, those guys are selling these cheap imports. We don't want any cheap imports. That's not where the profit margins are in our business. But the Japanese, by perfecting a low-cost, reliable car that doesn't break down for that lower-income worker, they eventually move up the value chain. They start building, Toyota starts building Lexuses, and Honda starts building Acuras, and they all of a sudden, have basically drive the Detroit companies to bankruptcy. I grew up outside of Detroit, so I lived this story, and that's what I see in El Salvador, is that if Bitcoin can prove itself in that market with effectively, very affordable transaction fees and all the reliability that we know that the Bitcoin network has, then there's really not much reason why it won't work everywhere.
Well, and that's a really interesting point, because Bukele was pretty brave to do this. Whatever he says, it's a brave move to become the first country. It starts to become common sense for the second and third, but you don't want to be the last, because you miss most of the opportunity.
It'll be too late. Yeah.
It'll be too late, and you've missed most of the opportunity. You're doing it out of obligation rather than opportunity. I think I've seen, Brazil now, I think I've seen, is taking a look. We've heard Panama, Cuba, various countries now, Ukraine. So I think the next steps on that will be interesting. But anyway, let's circle back.
Yeah.
So let's get back to the problem in the US and the role that Bitcoin will play in this. Because, again, it's another interesting thing. Bitcoin feels like a very American idea for me, and a very Texan idea as well. But it feels like a very American idea. It's innovation, and it protects private property. But it feels like a very non-US government idea. Mm-hmm. It's lack of control. That said, it hasn't been banned in the US, while it has been banned in various other countries throughout the world. And actually, we're starting to see a lot of interest from people within Congress, or political figures, or mayors, or governors, primarily on the Republican side. Senator Lummis, Ted Cruz. We've seen Warren Davidson up in Ohio. Just seen Josh Mandel. Mayor Francis. It's just a list that keeps growing of people who are in politics or in Congress who seem to be interested in Bitcoin. So, what is the role in Bitcoin in this U.S. fiscal position for you?
Yeah, so this is the heart of the article, and I think my thinking about Bitcoin all the way through. As I mentioned, the reason I got into it and the reason I hodled through all the ups and downs is because I had that conviction around the fiscal and monetary thesis that we've been discussing, and that fundamentally is about Bitcoin not necessarily competing with the U.S. dollar for buying your Starbucks. It can do that too, as you well know, mm-hmm. But the most important thing that Bitcoin can do, and the most important thing that would lead to a completely different economic system, is Bitcoin competing with the Treasury bond as a store of value for institutions and governments, and as a store of value for ordinary Americans as well. And what's interesting is that's not so much the conversation now in Washington. If you think about someone like Janet Yellen, who's now the Treasury Secretary, her view is basically that Bitcoin is this fringe thing that's used by criminals and terrorists and really has no real place in the mainstream economy. That's the view of a lot of people in the Biden administration. It was true of some people in the Trump administration as well. So that the irony of it is, a lot of people in the Bitcoin community think that everyone understands that Bitcoin is this threat, this frontal assault on the primacy of the U.S. dollar. That is not what Washington thinks. Washington thinks Bitcoin is worth nothing. That the average person in Washington thinks Bitcoin is worth nothing, and it's this completely fringe magic internet money that's basically that people are going to lose their shirts on. It's the kind of the hanky view, right?
Yeah.
And so the irony is, it may be that at the point in which it's obvious that Bitcoin is a competitor to the Treasury bond, it's too entrenched for the government to ban it. But there is this midpoint in which there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And I think part of what I'm trying to do when I walk Washington through a lot of this stuff is to say, look, yes, it's true that it's there. You should take Bitcoin more seriously. Bitcoin can be a competitor to the Treasury bond. It already is for a small but growing number of institutions and governments. But that's an advantage for the U.S. As you said, who knows exactly how much it is, but I say let's just back of the envelope and say that half the crypto wealth in general and Bitcoin wealth specifically is held in the United States. I think that's a realistic estimate, right? And if that's true, that's $500 billion or so of Bitcoin and $1 trillion overall of the crypto industry. And that's just the value of the tokens. That's not including, say, the stock market value of a Coinbase or the equity value of a Kraken or many of the unchained capitals of the world, like all these companies that are based here and built here that have equity value, that have net worth for Americans. So
also you have the jobs and the associated jobs that they for people down the line. That's like this, whenever you talk about like the problems with the car industry, but it's not just the automotive cars, the manufacturers, it's the part suppliers, it's the garages. It's like this is there would be a huge impact on the U.S. economy and the net wealth by banning this. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. There's a great example of that relatively recently, which is New York State was going to ban Bitcoin mining because some of the green types were saying this is environmentally terrible.
Yeah.
And it was the electrical workers union that sent a stern note to the Democrats in the state legislature saying, hey, these are good jobs. These are good paying jobs. We want these jobs. Don't do this to us.
I did not know this.
And that's how it got stopped.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a whole other subject, but the relationship between Bitcoin miners and the energy sector is like an area of knowledge, an area of debate and discussion which is growing fast, especially here.
Yeah.
But how the role Bitcoin mining can play within energy reform is incredible.
Absolutely. There is, as I think you are aware, a Compass Mining actually recently entered into an agreement with a nuclear energy startup here in town called Oklo. To basically use Bitcoin mining to take advantage of the extra energy that these next generation nuclear power plants will generate. They're called small modular nuclear reactors, and that's a win-win. It's a win for the nuclear guys, and it's a win for Bitcoin. Obviously, it's a low cost source of energy if you want to mine Bitcoin. But one of the challenges with nuclear is it's very capital intensive up front. And you have to recoup those costs gradually over time as the electricity charges come in. And so having Bitcoin miners as a customer early on and having that upfront contract in the case of a Compass, that's a big advantage and it helps accelerate the development of those technologies.
Wow. Okay, sorry. Back to the Bitcoin solution. So what is the role it should play? And also another question on that actually is if the US is buying half of the treasuries, just imagine if they were also stacking sats.
Yeah. There are probably some people who knows what the NSA is doing in its spare time, right? Like we can't completely rule anything out, especially given how much the competence there is in the U.S. government in cryptography. But having said that, we know that the Treasury Department isn't doing it. We know that the Fed isn't doing it because for them to do it would require a certain amount of public notice. So we know they're not doing it yet. And that means they're being left behind in a sense as the value of these other assets grows and grows and grows. And so the question really becomes how does the government react? And unlike I think a lot of hardcore anarcho-capitalist Bitcoiners, I'm of the view that there are things the government can do to damage the Bitcoin ecosystem. They can't ban the network, obviously. The network is independent of the US and the network will survive. Bitcoin as a network will survive whatever the US does to it, as China has proven, right? But if we want Bitcoin to have the most robust possible network, if we want the value of Bitcoin to represent the possibility of Bitcoin being this global store of value, this global store of wealth, then we should want there to be a friendly regulatory climate for Bitcoin. And specifically, the big area where the U.S. government can either mess things up or make things work is in Americans' ability to convert U.S. dollars back and forth to Bitcoin. Right now, that's obviously legal. You can do that. It's somewhat regulated if you do it through regulated exchanges, but it is legal. if the U.S. were to ever turn that off and say, no, we're just going to say, well, you can't do that anymore, that would obviously be a problem, right? That would be a problem for the people, the Americans who are trying to protect themselves from monetary and price inflation.
Do you think there's any appetite to do that, really?
I don't think there is appetite. I mean, I think there's appetite on the far left. I think Elizabeth Warren would be happy to do that. Another thing that we've heard that was rumored. I'll just say it was a rumor. I can't say it with any more definitiveness than that. But I'd say a credentialed rumor is that one thing the Biden administration was floating was saying, if you have capital gains from crypto, we're going to tax it at 80%. Which was a technique that the U.S. government used in the 19th century to eliminate wildcat banking. So in the time when the U.S., the continental U.S. wasn't fully settled, there were no dollar bills. There was not a paper currency at that time. And so local private banks would issue paper notes that could be redeemable for gold. And like certain stable coins, at least that it's hypothesized, right? Those paper notes were not backed by actual gold or hard money. And so a lot of people had these paper notes that were worthless. And so in the late 19th century, the U.S. government basically solved this problem, quote unquote, by saying, if you use these non-government, we're going to issue government paper currency, and the non-government paper currency we're going to tax at some punitive percentage. And effectively that wiped out the old private currencies.
Is this what Nick Carter wrote about recently?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's a fantastic article.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone should read it who hasn't. So that's the history that a lot of people in the Democratic Party's left look to say, hey, we can do that again. Whether it's stable coins or crypto or Bitcoin specifically, the way we can wipe it out, we don't have to ban it. We can just change the tax rate at which cryptocurrency transactions are taxed. Right now, they're taxed at the normal capital gains rate that you would pay if you had a gain in the stock market or with your home value. And if you change that to something really unfavorable, then you're going to drive a lot of people out of Bitcoin, for example. So all that to say that while we can be very pleased with ourselves and say the Bitcoin network is resilient and can survive war and can survive governments banning it, that's true. The network can survive. But in terms of a very important component of what attracts people to Bitcoin, which is the steady appreciation relative to fiat currencies, you can definitely impact that if you're the U.S. government. And I don't think there's an appetite to do that today. It would take an active Congress. And so the ways in which Congress are dysfunctional today in that sense work to crypto's advantage or Bitcoin's advantage. But it only takes 50 votes in the Senate and a majority in the House to pass a tax law change. And so just like with this infrastructure bill, where to some people anyway, there was this tax provision that came out of nowhere. It actually didn't come out of nowhere, but to some it did. You could do something like that was very punitive. And yes, the crypto community, the Bitcoin community would yell and call their senator, but would that be enough? With the infrastructure bill, it hasn't been enough. So there's danger.
Is that would be a federal tax?
It could be a state tax, but yeah, it really have to be federal, because if New York were dumb enough to do that, then everyone would just move to Texas or Florida or Tennessee. So it would have to be federal.
And how much recourse does, say, a state of Texas have to oppose such a federal tax? Because it feels like that would be a very bad policy change for what's happening here in Texas. Texas is becoming the Bitcoin capital of the world, not just the U.S.
I thought it was Bedford.
Well, I think
you're changing your tunes. Are they going to let you back in the country?
I think we're about even now. I think we got nothing. We got nothing in the UK. It's terrible. But is there any recourse?
No. Short answer is no. The recourse is you'd have to leave the country, and it's actually harder than that, because the U.S. has this really cute law where if you're an American citizen, you leave the country, they tax you as if you were a U.S. citizen. Yeah. So corporations can leave, at least under current tax law. They're trying to change that too, but individuals cannot. So that's a real danger, and that's kind of I think that's why there's the bear case for Bitcoin from an investment standpoint that you hear some people say, which is, they're just going to ban it someday if it ever gets too big for its britches. I don't think that will happen in terms of a true formal ban. But there are plenty of things short of a ban that the U.S. government could do that could drive the crypto economy here and the Bitcoin economy here overseas.
The Elizabeth Warren situation is really disappointing, and I feel like she needs to have a seat at the table with the right audience. I feel like she's obviously been sitting with the wrong people and been misled. And the reason it's quite disappointing is that I did a whole bunch of research for a series I made about Steve Mnuchin previously. And actually, I spent a lot of time watching her interrogations of Steve Mnuchin, and then follow up things in Congress where she was talking about Wall Street having essentially an arm of government. And you know what? She really stood up for the people. She really stood up against Mnuchin and what he did with, is it One West Bank? She was very critical of that. She was very critical of what happened in 2008. I feel like she's just not been explaining what Bitcoin really is and what it really means for, for the people I think she's thinking about. So I feel like if she had the right audience, she would become very pro Bitcoin.
Well, I'm less optimistic about that in the near to midterm, and the reason is that the way someone like Elizabeth Warren looks at Bitcoin today is there are a lot of people who have made a lot of money off Bitcoin who haven't paid the taxes they've owed. That's something that will offend her. There's a lot of incredible wealth that's been generated by people who were early in crypto, who and she's someone who doesn't like wealth inequality. Right. So those are the things that she sees that kind of dominate her perspective on it. And also the volatility, which in her mind means that ordinary people will be left holding the bag. If they've got an account on Binance and they've had 100x leverage and they get screwed, then that's terrible, and we shouldn't allow that. We shouldn't allow people to harm themselves by taking on risky investment strategies like that. So she will take those elements of the story and prioritize those over the things that you're hoping that she'll care about, which is, hey, this is a way to disrupt the big banks. This is a way to democratize finance, which I totally agree with.
And reduce inequality.
And reduce inequality, exactly, and protect people from inflation. All those things are true, but those other factors are going to be primal in her mind today.
Right.
I do think that as time goes on, and the tax question becomes a little bit more mature, where people are paying their taxes to a large degree, just like they do in the stock market or the venture capital market when they make lots of money, then people will start to see it as that. And I think that's sort of in a sense, the bull case for Bitcoin is that as the tax revenue starts to come into the federal government, they won't want to ban it for the same reason why Austin doesn't want large companies to leave Austin, and New York doesn't want Goldman Sachs to leave New York City, or the New York Stock Exchange to move to Miami. They don't want that because that tax revenue, those jobs, are valuable to their ability to fund the government, let alone to have a prosperous economy for their people. And so I think as that becomes more visible and that becomes a larger share of the U.S. economy, then you have more of a case to make that, hey, this is something you should be constructive on and understand its economic value.
All right. Well, listen, we got one other subject to talk about: CBDCs.
Oh yeah, baby.
Oh man. These things scare me. CBDCs scare me because all I can think of is the Fed running the currency and this becoming attached to social credit scores. So social credit scores is this distant thing in China, which is an authoritarian state, which now is one of the leaders in pushing forward with CBDC tech. So the idea of just having your money connected to a social credit score is the dystopian future none of us really want. But it doesn't seem as far away from Western nations as well now. There's certain... Rogan's been talking about the fact that having vaccine passports essentially is the first step to a social credit score. You can arbitrarily be cut off from parts of society if you choose not to take a vaccine. I'm vaccinated. I'm not anti vaccines. I understand why people are hesitant, but I believe in free choice. And I believe in private companies having the choice who can come into their business, but I do not like the idea of what's happening, say, in places like Australia and Canada, where people are being cut off from society, because this isn't a risk-free vaccine, but it's being treated like everyone should take it. So I'm in that position where I'm worried about CBDCs anyway. I don't want to give full control of my money to the government. I don't want my app to be telling me what I can have when I can have it. I just don't like that. That connected to where certain government policy seems to be going as an extra layer of fear for me. So there's my thoughts.
Well, I should mention as a side note that at my think tank at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, we did a lot of work on why lockdowns were the wrong answer to COVID. We've done a ton of work on that.
Interesting.
And that's maybe when you start doing your Bitcoin podcast, we can talk about.
Hey, listen,
that
we
more.
can talk about that. I mean, what's the TLDR on that? Because I was when we had the first lockdown, there's a lot of information that was coming in. It was people collapsing and dying in China, which I really want to know what that was about now. But also, there was a very serious situation in Italy, and we're very close to Italy.
Totally.
So I was a bit like, okay, I kind of like when the lockdowns happened, I said to my kids, like, this. Something we just kind of have to put up with, we have to protect the hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. And then I very quickly kind of realized it was nonsense and bullshit. What was your TLDR?
Yeah, that's like part one of it, which is, we saw the pictures out of Italy, the hospitals getting overwhelmed. It was starting to happen in New York City. There was a worry that we were going to have hospitals overwhelmed in New York City. So that those first couple weeks where we locked down, you could understand that was, we didn't know what was going on. Let's just sort of take a pause for a minute. But then there was actually one of our peer or competitor, rival think tanks that put out a paper saying that's normally pro-free market, pro-choice, saying, well, we've got to lock down the economy for a few months here, just a few months, and then we'll have these cures. The drug companies will generate these cures for COVID, and then we'll be fine. Then we can lift up the curtains, and everyone can go back to work. And I'm looking at that as someone who spent 12 years investing in startup biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies, understanding what the timeline is for developing new treatments, new cures, and how hard it is, and how uncertain it is, and how risky it is. I'm like, that is insane. It takes months, if not years, to develop new treatments. You're not going to have new treatments in a matter of weeks. And the average small business has about a month's worth of cash on its balance sheet. You lock them down for a month with no opportunity to get revenue, they're going belly up. Now, we solved that problem by printing the trillions of dollars and handing it to lots of people. So we at least kept many of those businesses afloat.
Deferred the problem.
That's the right way to put it.
I was in New York recently, and I think a lot of these restaurants are going to be going bust. The only restaurants I remember that were full were top end. The kind of regular restaurants in the kind of middle ground, many of them were kind of half empty. And someone made me realize recently, I don't know if this is correct, but they've just about to end the rent protection for companies within New York as well. So the view was many of these restaurants are now insolvent as well.
It's a problem. It's going to lead to more consolidation, more concentration of economic power, which is a huge problem. So the economic damage was being undersold by those who favored lockdowns was part of our argument. And the other part of our argument was that we knew enough in April of 2020 about COVID to know that we didn't have to lock down the entire economy. We knew that outdoor transmission was very, very low. It was mostly indoor transmission. And we also knew that disproportionately it was the elderly and particularly the elderly in nursing homes and long-term care facilities and care homes, as you call them in Europe, that where the deaths were happening. In the U.S., we were the first people to do this analysis. No one had actually bothered to do it before. 40 to 50%, depending on the exact time point, 40 to 50% of the deaths from COVID in the United States were taking place in nursing homes and long-term care facilities that housed 0.6% of the U.S. population. So we were locking down the country, going to panic, closing schools where kids are at almost zero risk of serious illness or death from COVID. We're closing schools, which is incredibly damaging to those individuals, to their communities. But we're not doing anything to solve the problem in nursing homes where people really are at risk of dying. So a big part of our argument was, if you actually look at the scientific evidence as to where the real public health risk is, let's be very aggressive in protecting people in nursing homes, but let's keep schools open. Let's try to figure out ways to keep every type of business open that can operate safely, not merely the so-called essential businesses. They define essential business. Well, you're a grocery store, you're essential. If you're a car wash, you're not essential. But what if you're like one of those robotic car washes where you just drive through and it's all automated? Like, you can operate that safely. You don't have to lock that down, right? So that was the kind of stupidity we were trying to get over and say, look, there's actually a lot of things that we can do to reopen society and reopen the economy. And yes, let's respect that the virus is dangerous for certain populations and be careful in those settings, but let's be case by case about it.
Right.
And Texas adopted that approach, which we were grateful for, as did Florida and some other states. And that's where the non-federal element of our system was really valuable, right? Because if we had a one-size-fits-all federal approach, which a lot of people were pushing for, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to get those recommendations, those ideas to different states. So we made an impact to a degree, but not everywhere, obviously, with those ideas.
Well, at least you had that impact, and it's been very clear for me traveling back around the US, where I've been to Ohio and Miami and Texas and Tennessee and New York, and I'm going to be going to Vegas, and I'm seeing it all.
Seeing the diversity of it,
I'm seeing the diversity of it, and for me, it's been very clear that Texas and Miami and Tennessee have got it right.
Right, absolutely. People aren't dying here at a significantly faster rate than anywhere else, and we've had a much more rational approach.
I'm not sure that's entirely true. I would want to double check that, because I did have a look at the death rates, and I think in Florida there was one point that Florida might have been like 1 in 4. Well, I can't remember that. I don't think that's exactly correct.
Well, I'm painting with a broad brush. If you want to get really precise about the stats.
Yeah.
So in 2020, let's say pre-vaccine is 2020 and post-availability of vaccines is 2021. In 2020, the death rates, say, between California, Florida, and Texas were roughly the same.
Yeah, I agree.
Even though California locked down heavily, Texas and Florida were much more light touch. In 2021, the death rates in Texas and Florida have been a little higher than in California. And the reason for that is there's a lot more vaccine hesitancy in Texas and Florida, where the vaccination rate in California is higher.
Okay.
So in 2021, the death rates are more driven by the vaccination rates. In 2020, they were independent of lockdown strategies.
It's kind of ironic, really, because you kind of want the mix of the two. I know some people will be upset by this, but you want to be as open as possible, and you want as many people who should get vaccinated.
Yeah.
That's the good combination. And what you've got is this kind of like mixed picture, where it's the people who are locking down the most in California are also the most protected.
Right.
So should be the most open.
That is the paradox. And the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have been a part of the problem here, where they've said if you get the vaccine, you should still wear 2 masks when you're outdoors, or like combining Fauci and CDC guidance. 2-year-olds should wear masks in school. I mean, it's just stuff like that just absolutely is not scientific, makes no sense, and leads people to mistrust public health authorities when they say things that are actually true, like the vaccines are safe and effective and you should get one. So that undermining of public health authority and public health trust has been a big problem here. And that's again, we could spend lots of time on that if we wanted to, but we should talk about CBDCs.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Yeah. I'd want to go away and do a bit of research and come back with just better knowledge, better facts to do that. But I think that'd be a fascinating subject to come into again. Let's talk about CBDCs.
Yeah. So it's one of the things that's interesting about CBDCs, and I was thinking about this as you were giving your introductory comments there. The crypto community has been curiously sort of pro CBDCs in the sense, if you read the press coverage,
you think.
So I'll explain what I mean when I say this. When I read the press coverage of CBDCs, a lot of it has the tone of, isn't it cool that the Federal Reserve is embracing the blockchain? Isn't it cool that even Janet Yellen is talking about CBDCs and Jay Powell, these people who we think of as totally distant from and removed from crypto and blockchain technology, they like CBDCs, and you hear another group of people say, well, I don't care about CBDCs, but they're inevitable. They're going to happen here. We should just kind of get used to it. You hear this a lot from, say, the venture capital community.
Well, forget the venture capital community. Where are you reading the kind of pro that they're into blockchain? Because it's definitely not in my circles.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and that may be because you're a Bitcoin centric guy, and so as I am. But when you read the crypto or broader crypto press, where maybe there's a more friendliness to things outside of Bitcoin. The view is, isn't it so cool that this rebel, non-mainstream technology that we have all embraced and we're on the early side of is now being embraced by the establishment?
Right. Okay.
Isn't that cool? That validates us as the crypto, the cypherpunks, right? And I've been just like, that makes absolutely no sense because CBDCs are tools of totalitarianism.
Of course.
And
do you know what? I put that on Facebook the other day. I wrote this piece on Facebook because I'm always trying to just share bits of knowledge with friends and family. I think most of them find me annoying, and they think I'm just some weird Bitcoin guy. But every now and again, one person gets in touch and says, "Do you know what? Tell me a bit more about Bitcoin." But I put a thing on there about CBDCs, and I said they're tyranny. My friend's mum, one of my mum and dad's best friends, blocked me. She said, "I've had enough of this now. I'm blocking you."
You sound a little bit like you're foaming at the mouth if you use words like totalitarianism to describe this acronym that most people don't even know what it is, right? So I'm mindful of that as someone who spends a lot of time talking to people in Washington, and I can tell you, when I talk to very senior people in the government who are actively thinking about this topic, they are like, oh yeah, CBDCs, this makes a lot of sense. It's a way of improving the settlement time for US dollars. The wire transfer system is so slow, and if we had a CBDC, we could do all this stuff more efficiently, and it's just the way of the world. We're just basically, we're using fintech to make the US dollar better, and boy, we wouldn't want we wouldn't want the ECNY, the CBDC for China, to take market share from the dollar. So we've got to keep up with them and have our own version. So these are the things that people are saying in Washington. They're not saying what you're saying or I'm saying.
Well, if they're managed by people with good intentions who you could trust, but the reason we have Bitcoin is you can't trust humans and money.
Well, one thing that is very helpful to those of us who don't want to sound like we're crazy, even if we might be, we might have our own eccentricities over time. It's not sounding like you're crazy is actually important when you're dealing with Washington, because if they think you're crazy, they're just not going to listen to you, right? And so one thing that was really helpful that happened recently is that President Biden nominated as the head of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the job that Brian Brooks had in the Trump administration. A woman named, I'm blanking on her first name, it's Saul Omarova.
Okay.
And Saul Omarova is a Cornell law professor who once wrote just a year or two ago, like a 60-page paper entitled the Democratic Ledger, if I'm or the People's Ledger. It's called the People's Ledger.
Was it about Bitcoin?
It was about CBDCs.
I know that. I mean, I knew you were going to say that. I'm making the joke is because Bitcoin is the people's ledger.
Bitcoin.
I mean,
so yes. Well, her view is, and she uses the term "peoples" in the way that we talk about the People's Republic of China peoples. She is a graduate of Moscow State University back when it was part of the Soviet Union.
Great. She's a communist.
So she literally wrote this paper saying the virtue of a CBDC is that we can use it to wipe out the private banking system. One doesn't need a private place to deposit to have a checking account or a savings account if you have a CBDC run by the Federal Reserve, because everyone would have their bank account at the Fed, and that would enable the Fed to deposit money in your account if they wanted to, or take money out of your account if they wanted to.
Which sounds like a big step towards communism. Well, certainly socialism.
Yeah, I mean, it's if people in the U.S. don't like single payer healthcare or state-run healthcare British style, well, wait until you have a British style banking system. I mean, not British style, but like a Soviet style banking system, like where you have an NHS, but it's the banking system.
Yeah,
where,
it sounds horrendous.
Yeah, and she talks about this as a good thing. She's like, well, if we had a CBDC, we could take money into your account, we could take money out. We could short stocks that we thought were overvalued. We could use the money to invest in green infrastructure, which is Congress's job, not the Federal Reserve's job. But because, of course, the Fed can print money, imagine if you basically didn't need Congress anymore. The Fed controlled the dollar, could print another $1 trillion to spend on whatever it wanted. That's the world that she's envisioning, and that is the world that a CBDC would enable. Now, when I talk to people in Washington, I was just there last week, kind of walking them through these problems. Some of them would say, well, we don't have to have a CBDC like that. We could have like basically a CBDC light where it's only a way for banks and the Fed to interact with each other. It's just sort of a fancier version of FedWire, the wire transfer system that the Federal Reserve uses. And it's restricted from any sort of interfacing with average people.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, like once you actually go through the trouble of creating a CBDC, which is actually the hard part, it's very easy to just flip a switch and say we're going to use this for a lot of these broader and more ambitious purposes that it isn't used for now. So one thing that I'm spending a lot of time on in my writing and my policy work is this topic, because people just aren't aware, particularly in Washington, and I think some in the crypto community, some very significant figures in the crypto community are not aware of how dangerous it would be if the Federal Reserve controlled every bank account in America, not only what money was in it and what money was not in it, but they could have visibility into every single one of your financial transactions. They could turn you off if they wanted to.
Automatically fine you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points I make in an article that is coming out very soon on this topic is, when China shut down Apple Daily, the pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong, they didn't do it by formally censoring the publication. They had jailed a number of the executives, including the publisher, Jimmy Lai. That didn't stop them from publishing. They were publishing while he was in jail. The thing that they eventually were able to do to shut down Apple Daily was to turn off their bank accounts.
It's like what they did with WikiLeaks.
Right. And the difference was there with WikiLeaks, they were able to get Bitcoin.
They got
right?
Bitcoin, yeah.
But that was now unavailable to Apple Daily because Bitcoin's banned in China. So they can't pay their journalists, they can't pay their suppliers, they can't pay their printers, and that's how they shut down Apple Daily. And so we do not want the government to have that level of control. It's particularly bad for lower income and average people. You think about the cybersecurity problem we have in America today, where so many things that are, should be protected private information are basically hacked out of government databases. Now you're going to say that the federal government, with its competence in those areas, is now going to have a record of every single financial transaction of every American. And it's just a sitting duck for some smart Russian or Chinese hacker to basically download all that information. It's absolutely insane, and there are a couple of people within the Federal Reserve System who've made some of these points, who've said, look, I mean, you're creating. The title of one talk by a Fed governor who's against CBDCs was, "It's a solution in search of a problem." Meaning, like, there are already things off the shelf. We can make better stable coins that are backed by cash or backed by hard assets that can serve the same purpose as a CBDC if your sole goal is to have faster and more efficient transactions. We can do that today. We can do that on the Lightning Network, right? Mm-hmm. There are lots of tools that we have to have fast, low-cost, efficient transactions. We don't need a central bank digital currency for this. And if you are a believer in decentralized financial technology, the word central in central bank digital currencies should be a problem for you.
Well, there's another big concern there as well. We only saw last week where the entire Facebook infrastructure went down, and I think that cost them $100 million, or was it $100 million an hour or something? Whatever it did, it cost Facebook a lot of money because of their mistake within the infrastructure. We actually have competing payment rails at the moment. So look, even if part of, the banks tend to have problems. Lloyds Bank might go down at some point, but I've usually got cash, or I've usually got a credit card like an Amex. I've got competing access to pounds that I can use whenever something breaks down. I also have Bitcoin now. If you give control of the entire financial rails to the US government, you create a central point of attack for if the financial rails break. Imagine the CBDC US dollar blockchain.
Right.
It goes down, like Solana went down, or like Ethereum went down. The entire country would ground to a halt. You wouldn't be able to do anything. So that to me is a big fear. And also, look, I don't like the banks, but I need banking services. And what I want is competition within banks.
Totally.
I don't want a high street bank anymore because they're annoying. I want a neobank, but I want banking services. I'm very fearful of CBDCs, and the fact that China loves them so much is a good indicator for me that they're fucking terrible.
Yeah, the fact that China is the world leader in CBDCs should tell you something. It should tell you who understands what the advantages and virtues or value of a CBDC is. The virtue of it is, and I'm using the word virtue in its broadest sense, that it allows you complete surveillance and control into people's financial lives. And this is why it has to be raised now, because you and I understand this, but Jay Powell, when you ask him what the virtue or the pros or cons of a CBDC is, always like, this is great. If we had a CBDC, we wouldn't need cryptocurrency. We wouldn't need Bitcoin if we had a CBDC. It's like, it's actually the exact opposite. If you have a CBDC, more people will want to use Bitcoin because they'll want that guarantee of privacy and resilience. And so that just tells you the level of education for very senior and influential and impactful people in our financial system who just don't understand yet these problems. Now, the good news is there was supposed to be this big report from the Federal Reserve. It was supposed to come out in September. It didn't, but it's going to come out at some point where they ruminate on CBDCs and their value. And my hope is that some of this feedback will start to filter into that report, and they'll acknowledge that there are risks as well as whatever the rewards are. They're totally overwhelmed by the risk, and that we won't see a CBDC. But I think more people who understand the virtue of Bitcoin need to vocalize that point, right? Because I feel like it's been very, very quiet. The Bitcoin community has not come out as a community and said CBDCs are a threat to our freedom. That has not happened for sure. And I think it's because, for whatever reason, it's just not been on people's radar. It is absolutely top of mind in Washington. and it's something that people really need to start bringing the fight to.
I think that's a really good point. Rishi Sunak, the equivalent of a Treasury Secretary in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think he is. Am I right in that? I'll have to double check that. But he's come out in support of CBDCs, and he annoyingly wanted to call it Bitcoin, which I thought was fucking embarrassing. But listen, look, I completely agree with you. It's a complete threat against our freedoms. Avik, I've loved this. This is great, man. We're going to have to definitely do this again.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've covered a lot of ground, man. We could have done a lot more. I would have loved to have got into some of the COVID stuff with you, but I'll come back and talk to you about that at some point, because I'm always kind of evolving my understanding of what it is and, response by governments and the pharmaceuticals. But I also love just talking to you about the healthcare industry, as I really want to see that report on Switzerland. I want to find out what they're doing. But I love this. Thank you. We should definitely do this again. Probably every time I come to Austin, I can be like, yeah, can we do something else? So thank you for your hospitality, and thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Peter. You're like the Anthony Bourdain of our community.
Oh, shut up.
It's just great. I've been a long time listener, so it's an honor to be here with you.
That's a praise which is too high, because I'm a big fan of Anthony Bourdain. But I do appreciate this. If people want to follow what you're doing, if they want to see any of the work you're working on, where can they do that?
The best place to find most of it is probably to follow me on Twitter at AVIK, just my first name. And our think tank is freop.org, F-R-E, F as in Frank, REOPP.org. It's the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Okay, amazing. We'll put that all in the show notes. Appreciate your time, and we'll do it again sometime. Thanks, Peter.